The morning Earl Pruitt lost his tractor was the morning he almost lost everything else along with it. It was January of 1951, and the thermometer nailed to the side of his machine shed in Fillmore County, Nebraska, had dropped to 22 below zero sometime in the night. Earl knew the temperature before he even opened his eyes. He knew it the way men who work land know things without being told, by the sound the house made, by the way the silence outside felt heavier than ordinary silence, by the particular quality of cold that came through the walls and settled around his face on the pillow like a second blanket made of ice. He lay still for a moment and listened. What he heard was nothing, and the nothing told him everything he needed to know about what kind of morning was waiting for him outside that door. He had 42 head of Hereford cattle depending on him. He had a wife and 3 children asleep down the hall. He had 160 acres of winter wheat under 3 feet of snow, seed corn in the crib that needed checking, water lines that could freeze without warning, and animals that needed feeding whether the temperature cooperated or not. The land did not care about the cold. The cattle did not care about the cold. The work did not stop because the world decided to freeze solid overnight. Earl Pruitt pulled on 2 pairs of wool socks and got out of bed. What happened in the next 2 hours, what happened in machine sheds and farmyards from the Dakotas to Kansas to the Ohio River Valley every single winter morning for decades, is a story that almost nobody tells anymore. It is a story about a problem so specific, so particular to a certain kind of machine in a certain kind of weather, that it has nearly disappeared from living memory. The men who solved it every morning are mostly gone now. The knowledge they carried in their hands and in their heads, the tricks and techniques and hard-won understanding they developed over years of frozen mornings and stalled engines and desperate, numb-fingered problem-solving in the dark, most of that knowledge went with them when they went. This is the story of carburetor icing, and it is also the story of how American farmers refused to let a piece of metal and a quirk of thermodynamics beat them. To understand what Earl Pruitt was up against that morning, you have to understand what a carburetor actually does, and you have to understand it the way a farmer understood it, not as an engineer, not as a mechanic in a warm shop with a parts catalog on the bench, but as a man standing in minus 22-degree air who needs his machine to run right now because 42 cattle are waiting and the wind is picking up and the morning is already burning away. The carburetor is the part of a gasoline engine that mixes fuel with air before that mixture enters the cylinders to be burned. Its entire function depends on controlling the flow of 2 things: liquid gasoline and moving air. Those 2 substances meet inside the carburetor in a narrow passage called the venturi, where the air speeds up as it squeezes through the restriction. That acceleration causes a drop in pressure. That pressure drop pulls fuel up through a small jet and atomizes it into a fine mist that blends with the incoming air. That mixture, the right proportion of fuel vapor and air, is what an internal combustion engine burns to make power. The physics of that process creates a problem that nobody who designed the first farm tractors fully anticipated. When air accelerates through the venturi, the pressure drop does not just pull fuel up through the jet, it also causes a sharp drop in temperature. The air cools rapidly as it speeds through the restriction. On a warm July morning, this temperature drop is insignificant. But on a morning when the outside air is already 22 below zero, that additional cooling can push the temperature inside the carburetor throat down past the freezing point of the moisture carried in the air. That moisture freezes. It coats the throttle plate. It builds up in the venturi. It encrusts the fuel jets. And the engine, deprived of the precise air-fuel mixture it needs, begins to stumble. Here is what surprised people when they first encountered it. Carburetor icing does not only happen in extreme cold, it can form at temperatures as high as 38 degrees Fahrenheit, given the right conditions of humidity. The combination of high moisture content in the incoming air and the evaporative cooling effect inside the carburetor creates ice in places where you would never expect it. This ice builds up gradually, restricting airflow, leaning out the fuel mixture, causing the engine to hesitate and surge and lope and eventually die. And when an engine dies on a blizzard morning in 1951, in a farmyard in Nebraska, and the temperature outside is 22 below zero, the dead engine is not a mechanical inconvenience. It is a genuine emergency. It is cattle going unfed. It is water lines splitting. It is a farm falling behind in ways that compound and spiral and can, in the worst cases, take years to recover from. Earl Pruitt understood all of this in the most practical terms possible. He had not learned it from a book. He had learned it the hard way, from experience, from the first winter after he bought his used Oliver 88 in the fall of '49, when the tractor stalled on him 3 mornings in a row before his neighbor, a 60-year-old Norwegian named Clarence Bjork, walked over from the next place and quietly showed him what he was doing wrong and, more importantly, what he needed to start doing right. Clarence Bjork had been farming that corner of Fillmore County since before the First World War. He had graduated from horses to tractors in the 1920s and had spent the better part of 30 years developing a working relationship with gasoline engines in winter conditions that was somewhere between mechanical knowledge and intuition. He knew things about cold weather engine operation that had never been written down anywhere, that existed only in the community of farmers who traded knowledge the way they traded labor, freely, practically, and with a clear understanding that what one man knew might save another man's season. On that January morning in 1950, when Earl's Oliver 88 quit and would not restart, Clarence walked over in his own time, looked the situation over without saying much, and then explained the problem with the patience of a man who had already solved it 100 times, and understood that a farmer who knows why something failed will not make the same mistake twice. He said, "Son, your carburetor is icing up." And then he showed Earl exactly what to do about it. The first solution Clarence demonstrated was also the simplest, and it had been used by farmers across the Midwest for as long as gasoline tractors had been stalling in cold weather. He called it priming with warm water, and the technique was exactly what the name suggested. Before starting the tractor on a very cold morning, Clarence explained, you bring out a container of warm water from the house, not boiling. Warm, roughly the temperature of a comfortable bath. The distinction matters. Boiling water poured over cold cast iron can crack an engine block or cause thermal shock to components that are not designed to handle sudden extreme temperature changes. You want warm water heated on the kitchen range and carried out in a lidded container, a mason jar, a metal canister, a coffee can with a piece of tin over the top held by a rubber band cut from an old inner tube. That warm water goes, carefully and slowly, directly into the carburetor's air intake. Maybe 4 ounces, maybe 6, depending on the size of the engine. Clarence poured it for Earl the first time, showing him the angle and the speed, the way you tilted the can to get a thin stream rather than a splash, the way you let the water run down the walls of the throat, rather than dumping it in all at once. The warm water serves 2 purposes at once. First, it raises the temperature inside the carburetor throat just enough to prevent the initial icing that typically causes cold weather stalls during the first minutes of operation. Second, and less obviously, the gentle steam it generates as it enters the airstream helps humidify the incoming air in a way that actually reduces the evaporative cooling effect inside the venturi, reducing the very process that causes ice to form in the first place. Earl stood and watched and filed every detail away. Clarence's hands moved with the economy of a man who had done something so many times it required no thought, and Earl studied those hands the way a young farmer studies anything he wants to be able to do alone on a morning when there is no one around to ask. The Oliver 88 started on the next attempt. Earl ran it to the cattle yard and fed his Herefords, and they ate without any idea how close they had come to a hungry morning. That evening, Earl came to Clarence's place, and they sat at Clarence's kitchen table while Clarence's wife put coffee in front of them, and they talked for an hour and a half. Not just about warm water, about everything Clarence knew about keeping a gasoline tractor running in a Nebraska winter, which turned out to be considerably more than one technique. The warm water method, Clarence explained, was the most immediate tool. The thing you reached for when you were already in trouble or when conditions were bad enough that trouble was near certain. But there was a whole range of practices that came before the warm water, practices oriented toward prevention rather than remedy, and those mattered just as much. The first was draining the carburetor bowl the night before. This was a procedure that many farmers had adopted after discovering that gasoline left sitting in the carburetor overnight in extreme cold could absorb condensation, develop water contamination, or partially separate in ways that made cold morning starting difficult and icing more likely. Draining the bowl before parking the machine in the evening meant that the next morning's start would use fresh fuel drawn directly from the tank, rather than overnight stored fuel that had had all night to pick up moisture from the cold air seeping through the carburetor's vents. Clarence's Oliver, a 1943 Farmall M that he had kept running through 2 decades of Nebraska winters, had a drain petcock on the carburetor bowl that he turned every single night before he went in for supper from October through March, without exception. It was as automatic as hanging up his hat. It took 15 seconds, and it had saved him countless morning problems over the years. The second preventive practice was the air intake cover. Clarence had been using a piece of heavy canvas, cut from an old grain sack, fitted to the shape of the air intake opening, and held in place overnight with a length of baling wire twisted into a simple loop, for so long that he no longer thought of it as a technique. It was just part of putting the tractor to bed. The canvas insulated the carburetor opening overnight, trapping residual engine warmth around the throat and reducing the temperature differential that cold incoming air would encounter when the engine started the next morning. Whether this made a measurable thermodynamic difference was not something Clarence could calculate. He knew it made a practical difference, which was the only calculation that mattered. Earl listened and asked questions, and went home and implemented everything Clarence had told him, and the following morning he started the Oliver 88 on the first attempt in 19 below zero, and he fed his cattle, and it felt like a significant personal victory. Over the next several winters, Earl and Clarence continued that kitchen table conversation in the incremental, ongoing way that agricultural knowledge transferred between farms in those years. Not a single long lesson, but 100 short ones. A comment over a fence, an observation at the grain elevator, a demonstration during a shared work morning when one of them noticed something the other had not seen before. It was Clarence who introduced Earl to the exhaust heat deflector, which was the third element of the cold weather carburetor management system that Earl would eventually use every winter for the rest of his time with the Oliver. The heat deflector was not a manufactured component. It was a piece of sheet metal. In Clarence's case, a flattened coffee can that he had cut with tin snips and bent with pliers into a shallow curved shape, positioned near the exhaust manifold so that some portion of the exhaust heat was directed toward the carburetor rather than escaping straight up into the air. The principle behind it was the same principle that the tractor manufacturers had attempted to address with the heat riser valve, a component installed in the exhaust manifold of many farm tractors of that era that was designed to direct hot exhaust gases past the base of the carburetor, warming the incoming fuel air mixture before it entered the engine. The heat riser worked well when it worked. The problem was that heat riser valves were frequently stuck in one position or another by the time a tractor had been in service for a few years. Corrosion, carbon buildup, and the general hard use of farm equipment meant that many heat risers were functionally inoperative long before their owners noticed. And the ones that operated freely on a new machine in the dealer's lot often did not survive 3 Nebraska winters in anything like their designed condition. Clarence's coffee can deflector was, in practice, more reliable than most factory heat riser systems because it was simple enough that it could not stick or corrode into uselessness. You put it in place before starting, you removed it once the engine was warm and running, and you stored it on the workbench for the next morning. It required no adjustment, no maintenance, no repair. It was a piece of bent tin, and bent tin does not fail. Earl made his own version in the fall of 1950, in the machine shed on a November afternoon before the serious cold arrived. He used the lid of a 5-pound lard can, cut it in half with tin snips, bent it over the horn of the anvil he kept in the corner of the shed, and drilled 2 small holes in the mounting tabs so it could be hung from a bolt on the exhaust manifold bracket. It took him 40 minutes and cost him nothing. He used that deflector for 12 years, until the day he parked the Oliver 88 for the last time and drove the new John Deere diesel into the shed in its place. By the winter of 1952, Earl had a complete cold weather starting protocol that he ran through every winter morning as automatically as he pulled on his coveralls. The night before, drain the carburetor bowl, fit the canvas air intake cover, prepare the warm water canister, and set it on the back of the kitchen stove. The morning of collect the warm water canister, dress for the cold, go to the shed, remove the canvas cover, mount the heat deflector, pour the warm water slowly into the intake, set the throttle to what Clarence called the starting position, 2/3 up, not full, not idle, push in the choke, press the starter. Most mornings the Oliver caught on the second or third revolution. On the very coldest mornings, the mornings when the thermometer was down past 20 below, and the air in the shed had the particular crystalline quality of air that is cold enough to make your eyebrows frost over in the first 30 seconds, it sometimes took longer. But it always started. Earl was not unusual in this. Across the Midwest and the Northern Plains, farmers who operated gasoline tractors in serious winter conditions had developed their own versions of the same essential protocol. The specific techniques varied: different farms, different machines, different local knowledge, different improvisational materials. But the underlying structure was consistent: warm the carburetor, protect the air intake, manage the fuel supply, control the starting procedure. Prevention first, remedy available as backup. In Minnesota and the Dakotas, where winters were reliably more brutal than anything Nebraska typically produced, the cold weather engine management philosophy tended toward the more elaborate. Farmers up in those regions had been operating in conditions that would qualify as emergencies anywhere further south, and they had decades of accumulated hard knowledge about what it took to keep gasoline engines alive when the temperature dropped to 40 below and stayed there for a week. One technique that had spread through the Northern Plains farming communities by the 1940s was the practice of routing the carburetor air intake to draw from inside the engine compartment rather than from outside air. The engine hood, on a running tractor, maintained a significantly higher temperature than the outside air, sometimes 30 or 40 degrees higher on a cold day, as the engine's own heat radiation warmed the enclosed space. Air drawn from that warmer environment would enter the carburetor already partly pre-warmed, reducing the temperature drop in the venturi and making ice formation less likely. Farmers accomplished this in various ways. Some fabricated simple sheet metal ducts that connected the air intake to a point inside the hood. Others used sections of heater hose or rubber tubing salvaged from other applications, or in the most improvised cases, simply positioned the air intake opening to face an area of the engine compartment where the radiated heat was greatest. The results were imperfect, but real. A carburetor drawing air at 15 degrees instead of minus 15 degrees was substantially less likely to ice up, and that difference, on a blizzard morning with cattle waiting and work to do, was the difference between a productive day and a crisis. The tractor manufacturers had attempted to address this problem from their own direction. The pre-cleaner, the large spinning bowl-type air cleaner that sat on top of the air intake stack on many farm tractors of the 1940s and 50s, was designed in part to draw air that had been warmed by proximity to the engine before directing it down into the carburetor throat. The Farmall M that Clarence operated had one of these factory pre-cleaners, and Clarence maintained it carefully because he understood what it was supposed to do, even though his coffee can deflector was, in his estimation, doing more of the actual work. John Deere's service bulletins from the late 1940s addressed carburetor icing by recommending that farmers in cold climates use a lower viscosity lubricant in the carburetor's accelerator pump, a small pump that injects additional fuel during throttle opening to prevent lean stumble. The standard lubricant could stiffen enough in extreme cold to cause the accelerator pump to hesitate, creating the lean condition that made icing more likely to stall the engine. Earl had read that bulletin. It had come through the mail from the county extension office and had implemented the recommendation on the Oliver, which used a similar pump design, and had noticed a modest improvement in cold weather throttle response as a result. The Massey Harris Company, whose tractors were widely operated across the Northern Plains in those years, published cold weather operating guides for their Model 101 and later the Model 44 that addressed carburetor icing with a specific choke management procedure for cold starts. The idea was to reduce the duration of rich mixture operation in the first minutes after starting, which reduced the amount of raw fuel passing through the carburetor throat and thus reduced the evaporative cooling effect that was one of the primary contributors to icing conditions. It was sensible guidance. Whether it was consistently followed on the farms where those tractors worked was another matter. The winter of 1936 had established the baseline of suffering against which all subsequent cold-weather farm experience in the upper Midwest was measured. Temperatures in North Dakota dropped to 60 below zero in some locations that winter, and the farmers operating in those conditions were doing so with equipment that had not been designed for those extremes, with fuel whose quality was inconsistent, with no money for repairs or replacement parts, and with no margin at all between maintaining operations and losing everything. What those farmers had, what saved many of them, and what formed the foundation of the cold weather knowledge that men like Clarence Bjork would carry for the rest of their lives, was each other. The threshing ring, the cooperative labor arrangement in which neighboring farms worked each other's harvests in rotation, had been the primary institution of agricultural knowledge transfer in rural America for generations. When tractors replaced horses, the threshing ring adapted. The cooperative structures that coordinated the movement of equipment and labor also served as the mechanism through which practical mechanical knowledge spread. Our man who had figured out how to keep his carburetor running in a blizzard showed the men who came to his place to help with work, and they took that knowledge home and passed it on in turn. Clarence had been 25 years old in 1936. He had been farming on his own for 3 years by then, with a used McCormick Deering 1530 that he had bought with money borrowed from his father-in-law. That winter was the winter that formed him as a cold-weather mechanic. He lost 2 mornings in the first 2 weeks of January to carburetor problems before an older neighbor named Halverson, a man then in his 60s who had been farming that county since the horse and buggy era, walked over and showed him the warm water technique and the bowl drain and 3 other things besides. Clarence never forgot any of it. He practiced it for 40 years. And when Earl Pruitt had his trouble in January of 1950, Clarence walked over and passed it on exactly the way Halverson had passed it to him, in person, with his hands, without charging anything for it, because that was how it worked. The knowledge lived in that chain of people, Halverson to Clarence, Clarence to Earl, Earl to his son Robert, who learned the warm water technique at age 12 and used it through his teenage years until the day the Oliver 88 gave way to a diesel and made it unnecessary. The transition to diesel was the great transformation of cold-weather farm operation in the 1960s. Diesel tractors solved the carburetor icing problem permanently and completely because diesel engines do not use carburetors. The diesel injection system delivers fuel directly into the combustion chamber under high pressure, bypassing the entire evaporative cooling in the Venturi mechanism that made gasoline carburetors vulnerable to ice. A diesel tractor parked in an unheated shed overnight at 20 below could be started the following morning, slowly, with attention to the glow plugs and with the right grade of fuel for the temperature, without any of the warm water and canvas covers and heat deflectors that gasoline operation required. Earl bought his John Deere 3010 diesel in the fall of 1963. He drove the Oliver 88 into the back corner of the machine shed, where it sat under a canvas tarp for 2 years before he sold it to a neighbor's son who wanted to use it for light work around a smaller acreage. On the first really cold morning after the diesel arrived, a morning in December of '63 when the temperature was 18 below, Earl went through the diesel's cold weather starting procedure, which was entirely different from everything he had learned and practiced for the previous 14 years, and the John Deere started. And he drove it to the cattle yard, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he was aware that a whole body of knowledge had just become unnecessary. He did not throw it away. You do not throw away knowledge that took years to earn. But he knew, on that cold December morning, that he would never again carry a warm water canister from the kitchen to the machine shed, never again fit the canvas cover over an air intake, never again position the coffee can heat deflector against the exhaust manifold bracket and twist the baling wire into its holding loop. That part of his farm life was done. Robert Pruitt, Earl's son, still talks about those winter mornings when he is asked about them. He is in his 70s now, and he talks about his father's cold weather starting ritual with the specific, unhurried precision of a man describing something he watched so many times that it is written into him permanently. He talks about the smell of the machine shed in January, cold iron and old oil, and the faint smell of gasoline that never entirely left the air no matter the season. He talks about the sound of the Oliver's engine in the first seconds after catching on a cold morning, the uneven loping idle of a six-cylinder engine that has not yet decided whether it is fully committed to running, and then the gradual smoothing as the carburetor warmed and the mixture steadied and the engine found its rhythm. He talks about watching his father's hands on the choke and the throttle in those first moments, the small, experienced adjustments that kept the engine alive while it made up its mind about the morning. He says, you knew what the engine was telling you. You could hear it. You could feel it through the seat if you had one hand on the steering wheel. You learned what normal sounded like and what troubled sounded like, and after a while you could hear the beginning of icing before it was far enough along to be a problem, and you could make the small corrections that kept it from becoming one. It was like a conversation between you and the machine. You had to pay attention, and the machine would tell you what it needed. That is as precise a description of what carburetor management on a cold morning felt like as any technical manual ever produced. It is also the kind of knowledge that no technical manual can fully capture. Knowledge that lived in the senses, in the calibrated attention of people who spent their working lives with these machines, who understood them the way you only understand something you depend on completely. The symptom of an engine beginning to ice, experienced from the seat of a working tractor on a cold morning, was distinctive enough that an experienced farmer could recognize it early and act. The engine did not stall suddenly the way it stalls when it runs out of fuel. It stumbled first. A hesitation at a consistent throttle setting, a slight roughness that had not been there moments before, a tendency to surge and then settle, and then surge again as ice built up in the carburetor throat, alternately restricted and partially cleared. Then the idle would begin to drop, not steadily but in steps, as though someone were slowly and intermittently stepping on an invisible brake pedal. A farmer who recognized these symptoms in time could act. The infield remedy for icing that had already begun, the technique used when prevention had not been enough and the engine was already telling you it was in trouble, was the direct application of heat to the carburetor. The most readily available source of heat on a cold farm morning was the exhaust pipe itself, running at anywhere between 300 and 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Some farmers carried a length of flexible metal tubing that could be temporarily positioned to direct exhaust gases toward the carburetor air intake. Others improvised with whatever was at hand, a piece of tin plate held near the exhaust pipe and angled to reflect heat toward the carburetor throat, a repositioning of the tractor so that wind carried exhaust gases back across the engine compartment in the right direction. This technique carried obvious risks. Directing hot exhaust gases toward a device actively mixing air and gasoline vapors created a fire hazard that any reasonable safety standard would prohibit. In practice, carburetor fires caused by this approach were rare. The airflow dynamics and temperature differentials involved worked against ignition under most circumstances, but rare was not zero. Farmers who used exhaust heat remedies understood the risk and managed it with experience. They had weighed it against the alternative, which was a stalled engine, unfed cattle, and a farm day that was already falling apart, and they had made their choice and been careful about it. This was the constant calculus of farm life in that era. Every dangerous technique was balanced against a concrete, immediate cost if you did not use it. The risks were not abstract. Neither were the consequences of inaction. You made the best decision you could with the knowledge you had and the tools available to you, and you paid attention, and most mornings it worked. Most mornings. The ethanol content of modern gasoline has, as something of a historical footnote, actually made carburetor icing a more significant problem in certain applications than it was in the pure petroleum gasoline era. Ethanol has a higher heat of vaporization than gasoline, meaning it absorbs more heat as it evaporates, which means it cools the incoming air and fuel mixture more aggressively than straight gasoline does, increasing the risk of ice formation at the carburetor throat under marginal conditions. This is not a concern that Earl Pruitt or Clarence Bjork ever had to deal with. The fuel they used was straight petroleum gasoline, and ethanol blending in farm fuel was not a reality of their era. But it is a concern today for the substantial community of people who still operate carbureted gasoline engines, vintage tractor collectors, antique machinery show participants, small farm operators who have never found a reason to replace equipment that still functions adequately. Those people, the ones who fire up an Oliver 88 or a Farmall M on a cold October morning for a show or a field demonstration, are in a sense maintaining a living connection to the knowledge that Clarence Bjork and men like him carried. When a vintage tractor collector instinctively reaches for the choke, listens to the idle, feels the seat for the vibration pattern that tells him the engine is happy or unhappy, he is practicing an attenuated version of the same sensory attention that kept farm operations running on blizzard mornings in Nebraska in 1951. The knowledge did not entirely disappear when the diesel tractor arrived and the gasoline era ended. It retreated. It became specialized rather than universal. It moved from the mainstream of active farm practice into the keeping of people who choose to maintain old machines and who, in doing so, maintain something of the understanding that went with them. Earl Pruitt died in 1987 at the age of 71. He had farmed that Fillmore County land for his entire adult life and had handed it to Robert in the mid-70s, staying on to help until his health made it impractical. Clarence Bjork had died some years before, in 1979, at 88 years old, still sharp until the last year, still walking over to neighboring farms when he thought his experience might be useful, still the person people called when they had a problem they could not solve. Neither man wrote any of it down. There was no reason to write it down. It was the kind of knowledge that lives in doing, in showing, in the passing of information from one pair of hands to another on a cold morning in a machine shed with a bare bulb overhead and a tractor that needs to run. It did not occur to either of them that the knowledge was worth documenting because it did not occur to them that it would ever be forgotten. It was just how you did things. It was just what you knew. But it has been forgotten. Not entirely and not by everyone, but substantially enough that a video about it can surprise people, can make people who grew up around farms in the 1950s and 60s nod and say, yes, yes, I remember that. I remember watching my father do exactly that with the coffee can and the baling wire. I remember the smell of the machine shed in January and the sound the tractor made when it caught on a cold morning and everything was going to be all right. That moment of recognition, the nod, the memory unlocked, the yes that is exactly how it was, is what this channel is built around. The real history of American farm life, told with enough detail and enough honesty to reach the people who lived it or who grew up in its shadow. Not the idealized version, not the postcard version, but the actual version, with the cold and the problem-solving and the danger and the improvised tools and the knowledge passed from neighbor to neighbor across fence lines in the kind of communities that do not quite exist anymore. If this video reached you, thank you for watching it all the way through. It means you care about the same things we care about. Please subscribe to the channel. We publish new videos every week covering the real history and the real practices of American farm life from the 1930s through the 1970s. If this video was worth your time, hit the like button and share it with someone who grew up around farms or who has ever worked on old equipment and felt that particular bond between a person and a machine that needs to run and will run if you know what you are doing. This video is inspired by true events and real historical practices documented in the agricultural history of the American Midwest. It does not seek to represent any specific individual or to offend anyone. Earl Pruitt is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced exactly this situation: cold mornings, iced carburetors, and the daily necessity of keeping machinery running when everything depended on it. The techniques, equipment, brands, and farming practices described are historically accurate to the era depicted.